At 4:45 p.m. on January 24, 1991, in East Harlem, New York, 13-year-old Paola Ilera returned home from school. Her mother buzzed her in as she entered her apartment building's elevator and headed for her family's 30th floor unit. However, she mysteriously vanished during that short journey. 3 hours later, around 7:30 p.m., a man out on a walk with his dog discovered Paola's lifeless body half a mile away from her home. As the sun set on that tragic day, the neighborhood was left with haunting questions. What happened to Paola, and who could be behind her disappearance and death? Paola and her family were part of the community of East Harlem, also known as El Barrio, located in the heart of Manhattan, New York City. This culturally rich enclave is renowned for its dynamic mix of traditions, art, and community spirit. East Harlem boasts a diverse population with a strong Hispanic and Latino heritage, evidenced by its lively festivals, eateries, and colorful murals that adorn its streets. The neighborhood is home to the famous Museum of the City of New York, showcasing the city's history. According to statistics, your chance of being a victim of crime in East Harlem is about 1 in 22. And it is here our story began. Paola Ilera was born in Colombia in the late 1970s to her parents, Cesar and Olga Ilera. She had 2 older siblings, Julio and Alexandra. In June of 1990, Paola, along with her mother and 2 siblings, moved to East Harlem, New York City, in hopes of finding a better life. They lived on the 30th floor of an apartment building at 420 East 111th Street, where they stayed with Paola's uncle, Guillermo Ospina. Her father, Cesar, remained in Colombia, working as a taxi driver, and was saving money to eventually join them in New York. Upon their arrival in New York, Paola started attending junior high school 99. According to her sister, Alexandra, Paola excelled academically, focusing her spare time on studying English and mathematics. She had only a handful of friends, mostly classmates, and aspired to become a lawyer to help those in need. Her uncle Guillermo described her as highly intelligent and mature for her age, thinking beyond her years. He also noted that Paola was very happy in New York because of her love for the English language. She was a young girl with many plans for the future, her uncle Guillermo said. Everything appeared to be going smoothly for Paola and her family until a heartbreaking event suddenly changed their lives. On the cold afternoon of January 24, 1991, Paola, who was just 13 years old at the time, left her school and made her way back to the familiar surroundings of her apartment building. At approximately 4:45 p.m., she arrived at the entrance of the building and used the intercom to call her apartment. Her mother, Olga, answered and let her in by pressing the button to unlock the lobby door. This ordinary interaction would be the final one Olga would share with her beloved daughter. With the door now open, Paola entered the lobby and stepped into an elevator, but tragically, she never made it to their 30th floor apartment. 10 minutes later, when Paola hadn't arrived home, her brother and uncle grew worried. They felt that something was amiss and decided to go look for her. As they hurried down to the lobby, they found it completely empty. They began searching the neighborhood desperately for Paola, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. 3 hours later, around 7:30 p.m., a man out for a walk with his dog made a chilling discovery. He spotted a lifeless figure lying on a walkway near the East River. The area was littered with drug-related items like vials, syringes, and used lighters. Tragically, what he found was Paola's slender body, and she had passed away. The site where she was found was located about a half a mile to the south of the apartment building where she lived. When detectives arrived at the scene, they were faced with a deeply saddening sight.
There was a stab wound in the center of her chest, and further examination revealed that she had a ligature around her neck. And there was hardly any blood coming from the stab wound.
There were no clues to indicate who might have committed this crime. The only things they discovered on Paola's body were a New Kids on the Block watch on her wrist and a piece of chalk in her pocket. Paola's murder profoundly affected not only her family, but also the entire neighborhood. Her mother Olga was inconsolable, struggling to come to terms with the loss of her daughter. At Paola's school, both students and teachers were in shock. In the aftermath of this tragedy, teachers held meetings with students to provide support for those who were close to Paola, helping them cope with their grief. They also advised all students not to walk alone in the area for safety reasons. In response to the incident, reporters were not allowed to access the school, and the principal and district officials declined to speak with them. Detectives were left with numerous unanswered questions. They went from door to door in the 32-floor building, hoping to find witnesses who might have seen Paola in the area where her body was eventually discovered. Unfortunately, they couldn't locate anyone who had seen her there. Moreover, the detectives had no information about the appearance of the person responsible for this tragedy. It remained uncertain whether Paola was killed in the isolated spot filled with crack vials where her body was found or somewhere else. Through their investigation, the detectives managed to piece together some important details. They discovered that Paola regularly stayed at school after hours for a journalism workshop on Wednesdays and Thursdays. On the day of her tragic murder, she had been working on an article about her father, intending to send it to him as a Valentine's Day gift. The detectives also found out that on that fateful day, Paola left the school after the workshop at around 4 p.m. and walked north along First Avenue with a friend. They parted ways at 106th Street, with Paola continuing to her family's apartment building. During their inquiries, the detective learned that another teenager named Aaron Wofford had entered the same elevator as Paola. However, when they spoke with him, he claimed to have gotten off at the 19th floor, while Paola continued upward. As a result, the detectives shifted their focus away from him as a suspect. The autopsy revealed the full extent of the terrible ordeal Paola had endured. She had been violated, strangled, and stabbed 3 times near her heart. The medical examiner also noticed unusual elongated marks on her thighs. It was clear that Paola had bravely resisted an assault, and her attacker had forcefully separated her legs, causing bruises on their thighs that matched the shape of their fingers. The examiner also collected male hair from her body. This was stored as evidence. On February 2, 1991, Paola's body was laid to rest at St. Michael's Cemetery in East Elmhurst, Queens. 4 months later, after her tragic murder, Paola's family decided to relocate to Flushing, New York, and they received support from Victim Services, a private nonprofit organization that assists victims of violent crimes and their families. In Flushing, Olga sought solace through counseling at the Families of Homicide Victims program, also run by Victim Services. As the family continued to cope and heal, they held on to the hope of achieving justice for Paola. However, as this time passed, Paola's case gradually grew colder, and the quest for answers became increasingly challenging. The murder of a 13-year-old girl should have been a major news story in any city at any time. However, in the violence-ridden New York of 1991, this dreadful crime in East Harlem was largely unnoticed. Between 1990 and 1992, the city reported over 2,000 murders each year, with an average of 6 bodies discovered daily across the 5 boroughs of New York City. Unfortunately, most of these occurred in impoverished, predominantly minority neighborhoods, such as East Harlem, the South Bronx, and East New York, Brooklyn. Regrettably, very few of these cases received significant attention from the media. Instead, the media often focused on more upscale crimes involving white, wealthy victims in picturesque locations. Without the pressure from the media or politicians, Paola's case became a low-priority homicide. Consequently, her murder remained unsolved and largely forgotten throughout much of the 1990s. By the mid-1990s, crime rates in New York City were on the decline. However, in the housing projects of East Harlem, a disturbing trend persisted. A series of seemingly unrelated incidents began to occur, all involving the assault and murder of young, attractive teenagers with large skin, regardless of whether they were Black or Hispanic. In 1994, a 15-year-old girl became a victim when she was confronted by an attacker brandishing a knife. This case revealed a consistent pattern used by the assailant, which he would repeat multiple times over the next 4 years. He would approach the teenager from behind and guide her to an isolated location. There he would blindfold her using a piece of her own clothing, coerce her to undress, and then subject her to assault. Remarkably, the 15-year-old survivor was able to provide a description of her attacker. He was a well-groomed young man with a muscular build, and he displayed an excessive sense of self-importance. Shockingly, he even told the victim that she should consider herself fortunate to be assaulted by someone as good-looking as himself. A few years later, on September 10, 1997, firefighters responded to a rooftop fire at the George Washington houses on East 104th Street.
A response from a Bronx precinct who had a missing person report of a young woman by the name of Johannes Castro.
In the aftermath, they discovered the lifeless body of a woman who had suffered severe abuse, had been struck with a blunt object, and was burnt so badly that she was unrecognizable. This victim was later identified as 19-year-old Johannes Castro, who had moved to New York from the Dominican Republic with her family. Johannes, a young mother with a daughter, had been pursuing her studies in computer science at a community college in the Bronx. 7 months later, in April 1998, a 13-year-old girl was the next victim in the same neighborhood. Thankfully, this young victim managed to escape with her life. 2 months after that, on June 2, 1998, 17-year-old Rashida Washington met a tragic end. She was found in a 15th floor stairwell of an East 112th Street housing project, having been robbed, assaulted, and strangled.
At the time we found her, we weren't sure exactly what had happened to her. We got the job as an investigative DOA.
She was nude underneath this shirt that was covering her almost like a shroud. It was like it was placed over her face and upper body, but she was nude underneath, no bra, no shirt.
Her lifeless body, with its naked torso covered by a shirt, had been positioned in a seated stance against the wall. Similar to the earlier victims, Rashida, a fashion student who worked at a clothing boutique, was petite, weighing only 100 pounds. Tragically, she was murdered just 3 days after celebrating her 18th birthday. In that same year, during the fall, 2 more young teenagers fell victim to assaults in the same area. A 15-year-old was attacked on September 25, 1998, followed by a 14-year-old on November 16. Thankfully, these 2 adolescents survived, likely because they didn't get a good look at the attacker before being blindfolded.
Interviewed her boyfriend. We interviewed a lot of people, but there was nobody that was really sticking out as a viable suspect.
Even as these similar cases continued to accumulate, the police did not publicly acknowledge the possibility of a serial murderer targeting teenage girls in East Harlem. However, due to the concerns raised by the parents of the victims, the police eventually decided to take prompt action. In the 1990s, there was a relatively small database of DNA samples on record because of widespread testing of convicted felons had not yet begun. However, a significant breakthrough had occurred in the autumn of 1998 concerning the East Harlem cases. New York police experts in forensics compared bodily fluid evidence from the Rashida Washington murder with evidence from 2 other similar cases in the neighborhood. These tests conclusively linked the same perpetrator to all 3 crimes.
From rape victim 1 was originally believed to be part of a different pattern. And as it turned out, that case was not part of that rape pattern, but had created a new pattern with homicide victim Rashida Washington and this rape case.
Finally, detectives had solid evidence confirming the existence of a serial criminal preying on teenagers in Harlem. In response, police leadership assembled a specialized task force comprising detectives with the sole mission of apprehending the suspect. The police took action by distributing a wanted poster that included a sketch of the serial attacker. This sketch was based on descriptions provided by the victims. Shortly after posting the flyer in East Harlem, a tipster who called in suggested that the detectives should closely investigate a 25-year-old man known as Ace, who resided on the 19th floor of the same building where Paola had lived. The police quickly identified Ace's real name as Arohn Kee, and this name triggered a memory. The name Arohn had initially surfaced during Paola's murder investigation. Detectives recalled the teenager named Arohn Wofford, who had been seen entering the elevator at the same time as Paola and had claimed to have exited on the 19th floor. The distinctive first name, Arohn, had also reappeared in the investigation of Johias Castro's murder in 1997.
They pull phone records and find a series of calls from Johias' home in the Bronx to a Cynthia Kee in Manhattan's East Harlem neighborhood.
I spoke to Miss Key on the phone. I called up, identified myself. I asked her if, she knew this, this person. She said no. She says, but I have a son who, is about that age. Maybe he might know her. So I asked her what her son's name was, and she told me his name was Arohn Malik Kee. And she said he wasn't home at the time. So I left her my name and number, and I said, do me a favor, when he comes in, have him call me.
Phone records showed that in the days leading up to her death, Johias had made numerous calls to a man named Arohn Kee. When questioned by the police, Arohn explained that Johias had been a friend of his girlfriend, Jacqueline. He accounted for his numerous phone calls by stating that the two women had been planning a shopping trip on the day of Johias' murder. The police also interviewed Jacqueline, who confirmed Arohn's explanation. It was only later that the police realized that Arohn Wofford and Arohn Kee were actually the same person. Wofford was his father's last name, and Kee was his mother's. This revelation connected Arohn Kee to 2 out of the 3 victims in the suspected serial killer case. He was the last person known to have seen Paola alive, and there was a significant history of phone communication between him and Johias in the days leading up to her death. These connections could not only have been coincidence. Detectives decided to dig deeper into Arohn's background. They found that he was an intelligent and reasonably well-spoken individual. He was born on September 18, 1973, and he had spent most of his childhood in East Harlem. During the time of Paola's disappearance in 1991, he was living with relatives in the same building as her. Arohn was known as a charming person with a knack for computers. He claimed to be involved in rap music production, although there was little evidence to support this claim. Physically, he stood just 5 feet 8 inches, and he was fairly handsome. His criminal record showed only 1 arrest for robbery in 1990, and he had spent little or no time behind bars. However, neighbors had a different perspective on Arohn. They described him as having a troubling side. He had a habit of peering through the peepholes of women in his building, and he often wandered around with a portable video camera, attempting to capture inappropriate footage. At this stage, the police didn't have much substantial evidence against Arohn, but they understood the importance of a thorough investigation. They focused on the assailant involved in the September 1998 incident, who had left behind a black FUBU cap and a gray sweatshirt. The detectives decided to look closer into these clothing items for leads. Their efforts paid off when they found a laundry tag on one of the garments. This tag eventually led the police to a dry cleaner located near Arohn's building. What made this discovery even more significant was that the client list at this dry cleaner included Arohn's mother, Cynthia. Every piece of information seemed to point to Arohn as a prime suspect, and law enforcement was increasingly convinced that testing his DNA would confirm his involvement in the crimes. However, there was a significant hurdle. Arohn had no DNA on record because mandatory DNA testing for accused felons in New York wouldn't begin until the year 2000. In the 1990s, obtaining a DNA sample was not as straightforward as bringing a suspect and asking for a swab. DNA tests were still seen as invasive procedures, and acquiring a sample required judicial authorization based on reasonable suspicion. Even though there was substantial circumstantial evidence pointing towards Arohn's involvement, detectives were aware that the details like the elevator ride, phone calls, and the laundry tag alone wouldn't be enough to persuade a judge to order Arohn to provide a DNA sample. Consequently, the police had to resort to an alternative plan. Their initial approach involved tailing Arohn Kee, hoping he would unknowingly leave behind a sample of his saliva, like through spitting or disposing of chewing gum. However, this tactic quickly proved to be unsuccessful. On February 8, 1999, detectives finally caught a break when Arohn was arrested for his involvement in the theft of a computer hard drive. Since there were no laws mandating DNA testing for arrested individuals in New York at that time, the police had to resort to a bit of trickery in an attempt to obtain a DNA sample. They devised a plan where a female detective disguised herself as a doctor. Wearing a white hospital garment, she approached Arohn and asked him to provide a saliva sample for what she described as a routine tuberculosis test. She handed him paperwork and hoped he would sign a release form. However, Arohn, being cautious, took the time to read the document. When he noticed a line mentioning DNA analysis, he refused to cooperate. He claimed that he was a practicing Jehovah's Witness and that his faith prohibited him from participating in any form of medical treatment. Arohn had figured out what the police were after, and he was determined not to give it to them. After finishing his meal that evening, he tore his paper cup into pieces and flushed them down the toilet. To further confuse investigators, he swapped his cup with that of his cellmate. However, the police were one step ahead. Shortly after Arohn's arrest, he had been in a shared holding cell with several other men. During their time there, attendants had provided them with cups of water. Detectives managed to locate these cups in a waste paper basket and sent them for DNA testing. Within just a couple of days, the results came back, confirming that a sample collected from the rim of one of the cups found in the police holding cell matched the DNA of the East Harlem criminal. By the time the DNA test results were ready on February 12, 1999, Arohn had already been released without bail, as he was only facing a misdemeanor charge related to computer theft. Meanwhile, the New York Police Department offered an $11,000 reward for any information that could lead to his arrest. Authorities soon discovered that Arohn had traveled to Brownsville, Brooklyn, and met up with his 16-year-old girlfriend named Angelique Stalling. Her parents believed that they were going on a Valentine's Day date. However, instead of sticking to their plans, Arohn and Angelique boarded a bus headed for Florida from Newark, New Jersey. Detectives grew concerned that Angelique might be in danger, potentially facing the same fate as the previous victims. After Arohn arrived in South Florida, he made 2 phone calls to another girlfriend back in New York. By this time, news of his status as a suspected serial killer on the run had made headlines. The second girlfriend, aware of the situation, promptly contacted the police and provided a tip that Arohn was staying at the Miami Sun Hotel, located just 2 blocks from the beach on Northeast 1st Avenue in downtown Miami. Responding to this tip, 2 New York detectives rushed to the hotel and began surveilling it. When they spotted Arohn and Angelique walking around inside, they called a Miami-Dade SWAT team for assistance. The SWAT team stormed the building and discovered Arohn and Angelique hiding under the bed on the hotel's 6th floor. And on February 19, 1999, Arohn was apprehended and placed in custody. When detectives attempted to interrogate Arohn about the East Harlem crimes, he remained silent and didn't provide any information. However, the police had a plan. They later observed and listened from behind a 2-way mirror as they allowed Angelique into the interview room. Arohn and Angelique believed they were having a private moment to say their goodbyes. During this conversation, Angelique pressed Arohn to explain why he had committed the crimes. Arohn's response was cryptic. He mentioned that he had bugged out and claimed to have had a sickness. After a lengthy 4-month legal battle, Arohn was eventually extradited to New York to face trial on 22 felony charges related to 4 assaults and the murders of Paola Ilera, Johias Castro, and Rashida Washington. DNA evidence connected Arohn to 6 out of the 7 cases. During the trial, in the fall of 2000, prosecutors John Irwin and Richard Plansky presented a powerful case. With a barrage of testimonies and DNA evidence against Arohn, they called upon 130 prosecution witnesses, including 2 of Arohn's victims. Arohn himself insisted on being the first defense witness to take the stand. Over the course of 2 days of testimony, Arohn displayed a range of emotions, from giggling like a schoolgirl to crying like a baby. He also expressed his anger at being prosecuted. His monologue, which was largely uninterrupted by the judge, prosecutors, or his own attorneys, covered a wide range of topics, including pop culture, drugs, rap music, jail food, and his reflections on the criminal justice system. With many of his victims' family members present in the courtroom, Arohn wove a bizarre narrative to explain why he found himself facing charges of brutal serial violence against young women. He asserted that the police had conspired to frame him as a part of a cover-up orchestrated by a corrupt medical examiner who was involved in harvesting and selling human organs. He even claimed that his DNA had been manipulated in what he referred to as genetic shuffling. However, the jury did not buy into his elaborate story. On December 16, 2000, when the guilty verdict was delivered, the courtroom burst into cheers. As Arohn was later led past the crowd of grieving relatives, he directed a profane curse at them. During the sentencing a month later, in January 2001, family members of Arohn's victims had the opportunity to speak directly to him. Olga, Paola's mother, addressed him, expressing her wish that he would understand the torment of sleepless nights, loss of appetite, the inability to walk or breathe, and the absence of peace, all the while thinking about her daughter's suffering at the time of her death. Olga spoke of her enduring pain, having brought her daughter to the country in pursuit of the American dream. When it was Arohn's turn to speak at the sentencing hearing, he began to cry and said that he was sorry. In response to this, a male cousin of Johias Castro erupted in anger and attempted to leap over the barrier in an effort to attack Arohn. Following this, Justice Joan Sodolnik delivered the sentence. She imposed 3 life sentences on Arohn, each without the possibility of parole, for the 3 murders. Additionally, he received a 400-year sentence for 4 counts of abuse. Arohn was incarcerated in the Clinton Correctional Facility, located in Dannemora, New York. By the time Arohn was sentenced, lawmakers in New York and many other states had enacted laws requiring DNA testing for individuals arrested in connection with violent crimes. Since then, this testing has been expanded to encompass most felony arrests, spanning both violent and nonviolent offenses. Moreover, certain jurisdictions have initiated DNA testing for individuals arrested for misdemeanors. For Olga, the agony of losing Paola remains as raw as ever. She understands all too clearly that the anguish stemming from the sudden and senseless loss of a loved one doesn't fade with time, especially when so many unresolved questions linger. As we conclude this heart-wrenching journey through Paola's tragic story, her memory and that of the other victims lingers in our thoughts. Reflecting on Arohn's actions and consequences he faced, we are left with thought-provoking questions. What drives an individual like Arohn to commit crimes like this? And how can society identify and address the factors that lead to such behavior? If you have any other comments or would like to suggest other cases you would like us to cover, please feel free to share your thoughts below. We appreciate your feedback and value your engagement. Don't forget to also like, share, and subscribe.